The atmosphere of the foundry world was a thick, orange-tinted haze that tasted of ozone and recycled nitrogen, a constant reminder of the industrial engine that never ceased its rhythmic pounding beneath the crust. Kress stood on the observation gantry, his boots vibrating with the resonance of the heavy tectonic siphons deep below the surface. He adjusted the seal on his environmental suit, ensuring the pressurized seam was locked tight against the corrosive dust that swirled outside the reinforced glass. The landscape was a jagged tapestry of obsidian spires and glowing heat sinks, where the very rock was being bled of its thermal energy to power the orbital shipyards. This was not a world for the faint of heart, nor was it a world that invited the presence of those who could not contribute to the relentless output required by the expansion fleets. Kress looked out toward the horizon, where the massive silhouette of a void hauler was slowly ascending through the cloud layers, its engines carving a path of white-hot plasma through the murky sky. He had spent his entire life within the confines of these metal corridors, learning the language of the machines and the temperament of the molten alloys that flowed like blood through the arteries of the station. There was a certain pride in the grit and the soot, a sense of belonging to a species that refused to be dwarfed by the vacuum of space or the hostile environments of the planets they claimed. The data slate in his hand chimed softly, indicating a priority transmission from the lower cooling arrays. It was a section of the facility that had been plagued by intermittent power surges for weeks, baffling the technical teams who had attempted to stabilize the grid. Kress swiped through the diagnostics, his brow furrowed as he noted the strange fluctuations in the magnetic containment fields. It was as if something was pulling power directly from the source, bypassing the primary distribution hubs and leaving a trail of ghost signals in its wake. He knew he should report it to the sector overseer, but there was a nagging curiosity that tugged at him, a feeling that this was more than just a mechanical failure. The reports from the outer rim had been growing increasingly erratic, with talk of strange sightings and inexplicable disappearances among the independent mining colonies. Most dismissed it as the ramblings of isolated crews suffering from deep space psychosis, but Kress had always been more inclined to look at the numbers. The numbers did not lie, and right now, the energy consumption of the cooling arrays was defying every law of thermodynamics he had ever mastered. He stepped off the gantry and began the long descent into the bowels of the station, the elevator cage rattling as it dropped through kilometers of reinforced steel and humming conduits. As he descended, the air grew warmer, and the ambient noise shifted from the high-pitched whine of the ventilation fans to the deep, guttural thrum of the geothermal taps. He passed levels dedicated to heavy fabrication, where massive robotic arms moved with terrifying precision, welding together the hulls of scout ships in a shower of blue sparks. No one looked up as he passed. The workers here were focused on their quotas, their faces obscured by welding masks or filtered respirators. There was no room for idle conversation in a place where a single mistake could lead to a catastrophic breach or a structural collapse. Kress felt a kinship with these silent figures, a shared understanding of the burden they all carried. Humans were the newcomers to the galactic stage, often viewed with a mixture of pity and contempt by the older, more established civilizations who had long ago forgotten what it meant to struggle for survival. But those older races did not understand the sheer tenacity of a species that had been forged in the fires of its own ambition. When the elevator finally reached the bottommost level, Kress stepped out into a cavernous chamber filled with the smell of scorched copper and damp earth. This was where the station met the planet's mantle, a place of extreme pressure and volatile energies. The walls were lined with massive superconducting coils that hummed with a frequency that made his teeth ache. He moved toward the primary junction box for the cooling arrays, his flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the shadows. The floor was covered in a layer of fine metallic dust that puffed up around his feet with every step. As he approached the junction, he saw that the heavy security door had been pried open, the metal twisted as if by a force that ignored the structural integrity of the titanium alloy. His heart began to race, his hand moving instinctively to the heavy wrench at his belt. This was not the work of a malfunctioning drone or a rogue power surge. This was deliberate. Inside the junction room, the air was shimmering with a strange, iridescent light that didn't seem to have a physical source. It pulsed slowly, casting long, distorted shadows against the banks of machinery. Kress moved closer, his breathing shallow and quick inside his helmet. In the center of the room, hovering just above the floor, was a device he did not recognize. It was a sleek, silver sphere, its surface perfectly smooth and reflecting the interior of the room with unsettling clarity. It was smaller than a basketball, yet it seemed to possess a weight and presence that dominated the entire space. As he watched, a thin strand of energy arced from the sphere to the main power bus, drawing a continuous stream of electricity into itself. The sphere wasn't just consuming power, it was feeding on it, growing brighter and more vibrant with every passing second. Kress realized with a jolt of terror that this was an intrusion, a sophisticated piece of technology that had bypassed every layer of the station's security to plant itself in the most vulnerable part of the infrastructure. He reached for his comms to sound the alarm, but the device remained silent, the signal blocked by the intense magnetic field radiating from the sphere. He was alone in the dark, miles below the surface, facing a piece of technology that defied everything he knew about engineering. But Kress was not one to panic. He had been trained to solve problems under pressure, to find the flaw in the system and exploit it. He began to circle the sphere, looking for any sign of a seam or an interface point. He noticed that the pulses of light were synchronized with the rhythmic thrum of the station's geothermal taps. The sphere was mimicking the heartbeat of the world, masking its own energy signature by blending in with the background noise of the foundry. It was a brilliant design, one that suggested an intelligence that understood the nuances of human industry. As he leaned in for a closer look, the surface of the sphere suddenly rippled, shifting from a solid silver to a translucent blue. For a brief moment, Kress thought he saw a flicker of data scrolling across the interior, symbols that were alien and complex. Then, the sphere let out a low, vibrating hum that vibrated through his very bones. It felt like a warning, or perhaps a greeting. Kress stood his ground, his grip tightening on his wrench. He knew that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire world above. The expansion fleets were preparing to depart, millions of lives hanging in the balance, and here, in the cold dark of the sublevels, a silent observer had made its presence known. He took a deep breath, the filtered air tasting of metal and anticipation, and reached out toward the sphere. He wasn't sure if he was trying to disable it or simply understand it, but he knew that silence was no longer an option. The iron horizon was shifting, and humanity would have to prove once again that they were more than just builders of machines. They were survivors who would not be easily displaced from the stars they had worked so hard to reach. The sphere reacted before his fingers could make contact. A sudden, violent discharge of energy threw Kress backward, his body slamming into a stack of heavy crates with enough force to knock the wind out of him. He gasped, his vision swimming with spots of white light as he struggled to regain his footing. The sphere was now glowing with an intense, blinding radiance, the hum rising to a deafening shriek that bypassed the soundproofing of his helmet. Alarms began to blare throughout the chamber as the station's automated systems finally registered the catastrophic energy drain. Red emergency lights flickered on, casting a bloody hue over the scene. Kress scrambled to his feet, his mind racing through possible scenarios. If the sphere continued to draw power at this rate, it would cause a thermal runaway in the geothermal taps, potentially destabilizing the entire crust of the planet. He had to stop it, but he had no weapons and no way to call for reinforcements. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on a high-pressure coolant line that ran along the ceiling. If he could rupture the line directly above the sphere, the sudden influx of liquid nitrogen might be enough to disrupt the magnetic field or short out the internal circuitry. It was a desperate plan, one that would likely result in his own death if the pressure release was too violent, but he didn't see another choice. He climbed onto a nearby maintenance ladder, his movements clumsy in the heavy suit. The shriek of the sphere was now so loud it felt like a physical weight pressing against his skull. He reached the coolant line and saw the manual override valve frozen shut by years of disuse. He braced himself, using all of his strength to turn the heavy iron wheel. For a second, nothing happened, and then, with a sharp crack, the valve gave way. A jet of freezing white vapor erupted from the line, dousing the sphere in a torrent of liquid nitrogen. The reaction was instantaneous. The sphere began to hiss and spark, the translucent blue surface cracking under the extreme temperature shift. The light began to flicker and dim, the shriek descending into a low, dying moan. Kress held on to the ladder, his gloved hands numb from the cold, as the entire chamber was filled with a thick fog of evaporating nitrogen. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs, until the noise finally ceased. The red emergency lights continued to pulse, but the overwhelming presence of the sphere had vanished. He climbed down from the ladder, his legs shaking, and approached the center of the room. The sphere was gone, replaced by a pile of shattered, crystalline fragments that glittered in the dim light. It looked like broken glass, yet when he reached out to touch a piece, it felt as cold as the void itself. He picked up a fragment, turning it over in his hand. It was etched with microscopic patterns, a language of light and shadow that spoke of a far-off origin. Kress sat back against the crates, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged up his visor. He had survived, but he knew this was only the beginning. The sphere had been a probe, a scout sent to test the defenses of a world it deemed important. And while he had destroyed this one, he knew there were others out there, hidden in the dark corners of the galaxy, waiting for their turn to strike. He looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the millions of people living on the surface, oblivious to the threat that had nearly ended them all. He would have to tell them. He would have to find a way to make the overseers listen, to convince them that the expansion fleets weren't just a sign of progress, but a necessity for survival. As the fog began to clear, Kress stood up and began the long walk back to the elevator. He was no longer just a technician on a foundry world. He was a witness to a wider, more dangerous universe, and he would do whatever it took to make sure humanity was ready for whatever came next. The orange sky of the surface would feel different now, less like a ceiling and more like a gateway to a battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than the future of his kind. The elevator ride back to the surface felt like it lasted for hours. Kress watched the floor numbers tick upward, each level bringing him closer to a world that no longer felt quite the same. When the doors finally opened on the main administrative level, he was greeted by a swarm of security personnel and technicians, all of them talking at once. The energy surge had been felt throughout the entire station, causing localized blackouts and triggering a full-scale lockdown of the lower levels. Kress pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim and set. He ignored the questions and the frantic demands for an explanation, heading straight for the central command hub. He had a fragment of the enemy in his pocket, and he wasn't going to stop until the people in charge understood exactly what they were up against. The iron horizon was indeed shifting, and for the first time in his life, Kress felt a flicker of true fear. But beneath that fear was a spark of defiance, the same industrial grit that had built this world and would, if necessary, defend it until the very end. He reached the command hub and slammed the crystalline fragment onto the central map table, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter of the officers. They turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of confusion and irritation. But as their eyes fell on the glowing shard, their voices died away. Even in the harsh light of the command center, the fragment held an alien allure, a cold and ancient beauty that spoke of things far beyond their comprehension. Kress looked the sector overseer in the eye, his voice steady and clear despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull him down. He told them everything, from the strange power surges to the final, desperate struggle in the cooling arrays. He didn't embellish, and he didn't hesitate. He spoke with the authority of someone who had looked into the abyss and survived. And as he finished his story, he saw the realization dawn on their faces. The peace they had enjoyed for so long was an illusion, a brief respite in a galaxy that was far more crowded and far more hostile than they had ever imagined. The Foundry world was not just a factory, it was a fortress, and it was time they started acting like it. The atmospheric scrubbers in the command deck groaned with the effort of filtering the sudden influx of microscopic particulates shed by the crystalline fragment. High Overseer Vane did not move, his eyes locked on the shimmering shard that Kress had deposited onto the holomap. Around them, the tactical displays flickered with the aftershocks of the power surge, showing red cascading failures across the geothermal subsectors. Vane was a man carved from the same industrial bedrock as the station itself, his skin the color of cured leather and his hands scarred by decades of proximity to high-output reactors. He reached out, his fingers hovering just millimeters above the fragment, sensing the unnatural cold radiating from its jagged edges. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic alarms that had defined the last hour. Kress stood his ground, his environment suit still streaked with frozen nitrogen and the soot of the lower deeps. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the skepticism of the junior officers battling with the undeniable physical evidence resting on the table. Finally, Vane looked up, his expression unreadable. He beckoned to a nearby technician, a woman named Sura who specialized in exotic material analysis. She approached with a portable scanner, her movements clinical and precise despite the tension thick enough to choke. As the scanning beams swept over the fragment, the holomap above the table distorted, the orange light of the Foundry world's topographical data replaced by a chaotic storm of geometric patterns. Sura hissed through her teeth, her eyes widening as she read the scrolling telemetry on her handheld device. She looked at Vane and then at Kress, her voice barely a whisper. She explained that the material was not a mineral, nor was it a manufactured alloy in any sense understood by human metallurgy. It was a lattice of solid-state information, a physical manifestation of a processing core that used quantum entanglement to draw energy from the vacuum itself. The sphere Kress had encountered wasn't just a battery. It was a localized tear in the fabric of space, a siphon that could have eventually collapsed the entire planetary mantle if it hadn't been disrupted by the thermal shock of the coolant. The revelation sent a ripple of unease through the command staff. If such a device could be planted so easily within the most secure facility on the planet, then the orbital shipyards and the expansion fleets were equally vulnerable. Vane turned back to the map, his hand swiping to enlarge the sector surrounding their system. He pointed to a series of dark nebulae on the galactic fringe, regions that had remained largely unexplored due to the navigational hazards of their high-density dust clouds. He remarked that the independent miners had been reporting ghost signals from those sectors for months, sightings of silver craft that moved with a fluid grace that mocked the laws of inertia. Until now, the Central Administration had classified these as atmospheric anomalies or pirate raids. But with the fragments sitting before them, that narrative was no longer sustainable. They were being watched, and the entity watching them possessed a level of technological sophistication that made their massive foundry machines look like primitive stone tools. Kress stepped forward, his voice rasping from the dry air of the command deck. He argued that the sphere's mimicry of the station's heartbeat suggested a deep understanding of their infrastructure. It wasn't just a random probe. It was a calibrated tool designed to integrate with their specific technology. This implied a long period of observation, perhaps spanning decades. The foundry world, with its massive energy output and strategic importance as a refueling hub for the expansion fleets, was the perfect target for a decapitation strike. If the planet's crust had been compromised, the resulting explosion would have wiped out the orbital shipyards and stalled human expansion into this quadrant for a century. The genius of the attack lay in its subtlety. It would have looked like a natural disaster, a tragic failure of human engineering rather than an act of war. Vane nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the strategic implications. He ordered a total blackout of all non-essential transmissions and directed the security teams to conduct a floor-by-floor sweep of every sublevel on the planet. They were looking for more spheres, more silent observers tucked away in the shadows of the machinery. He then turned his attention to the orbital defense grid, commanding the activation of the long-range sensor arrays that had been mothballed during the long years of industrial peace. The transition to a war footing was swift and jarring. The rhythmic thrum of production was replaced by the harsh, urgent signals of mobilization. Kress watched as the command deck transformed, the administrative staff replaced by tactical coordinators and logistics officers who spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of those preparing for the unthinkable. Sura requested that Kress accompany her to the high-security labs in the upper spires. She needed his first-hand account of the sphere's behavior to calibrate the scanners for the global search. As they walked through the corridors, Kress noticed the change in the atmosphere of the station. The workers were no longer just focused on their quotas. They were gathered in small groups, whispering about the lockdown and the strange lights in the sky. Rumors were spreading like wildfire, fueled by the sudden appearance of armed security details at every junction. The industrial grit that Kress had so admired was now tinged with an edge of desperation. Humans were a resilient lot, but they were also a species that relied heavily on the stability of their tools and the predictability of their environment. The realization that their greatest achievements were being toyed with by an unseen predator was a bitter pill to swallow. Inside the lab, Sura placed the fragment into a containment field, the shimmering blue light reflecting off the sterile white walls. She began a series of high-frequency resonance tests, attempting to provoke a reaction from the material. For hours, Kress sat in the corner of the lab, recounting every detail of his encounter. He described the way the light had rippled, the specific frequency of the hum, and the sensation of the energy discharge that had nearly killed him. Sura recorded it all, her brow furrowed in concentration. She discovered that the fragment was still attempting to transmit, sending out a faint, pulse-like signal that was being absorbed by the containment field. It was calling out to its source, providing a beacon for whatever had sent it. This meant that the destruction of the sphere had not gone unnoticed. The entities behind it now knew that their presence had been detected, and that their scout had been neutralized by a common technician. As the sun began to set behind the jagged horizon of the Foundry world, casting long, bloody shadows across the obsidian plains, the long-range sensors in orbit picked up something. It was a ripple in the gravitational field of the outer system, a distortion that suggested the arrival of multiple large masses. Vane's voice came over the station-wide intercom, calm yet heavy with the weight of his command. He announced that a fleet of unknown origin had entered the system and was currently on a direct intercept course with the Foundry world. They were not responding to hails, and their signatures matched nothing in the colonial archives. The expansion fleets were being recalled from their berths, their skeletal crews working frantically to bring the massive engines online. The industrial heart of humanity was being challenged, and the time for quiet observation had ended. Kress looked out the lab window, watching the lights of the orbital shipyards flare to life. The massive hulls of the scout ships and heavy haulers were silhouetted against the stars, a testament to the sheer scale of human ambition. He felt a surge of cold determination. He had been the first to see the enemy, and he would not be the last to fight them. He turned to Sura, who was staring at the sensor data with a look of pure terror. He told her that they needed to find a way to use the fragment against the incoming fleet. If it was a lattice of information, then it could be corrupted. If it was a receiver, it could be turned into a jammer. They didn't have the luxury of time or the resources for a prolonged study. They had to be as unpredictable and as aggressive as the species that had built this world. Sura hesitated, then nodded, her fear replaced by a sharp, academic focus. She began to reconfigure the containment field, bypassing the safety protocols that prevented the injection of raw data into the fragment. They were going to try to feed the enemy's own logic back into their system, a digital poison designed to disrupt the quantum entanglement that powered their ships. It was a long shot, a gamble that relied on the hope that the enemy's sophistication was also their greatest weakness. As the first of the alien vessels broke through the cloud layer, their silver hulls reflecting the orange glow of the Foundry, Kress and Sura worked in the dim light of the lab, their hands steady as they prepared to strike back. The iron horizon was no longer a distant concept. It was right outside their window, and it was burning with the fires of an approaching war. The first engagement was a brutal, one-sided affair. The orbital defense platforms, designed to ward off pirates and small-scale incursions, fired their heavy kinetic slugs at the approaching silver craft. The rounds, each weighing several tons and traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, should have shattered the alien hulls on impact. Instead, the silver ships seemed to ripple, the kinetic energy absorbed and dissipated across their surfaces like pebbles dropped into a pond. The aliens did not return fire with conventional weapons. Instead, they emitted pulses of the same blue light Kress had seen in the cooling arrays. Wherever the light touched a human vessel, the electronics died instantly, the life support systems failed, and the structural integrity of the hulls began to dissolve into fine metallic dust. It wasn't an explosion. It was a systematic deconstruction of human technology. Vane's voice returned to the comms, ordering all remaining ships to retreat to the planet's shadow. They were losing the battle for the high ground, and the Foundry world was now the only thing standing between the alien fleet and the core human colonies. Kress watched as a massive heavy hauler, a ship he had helped maintain only months ago, was reduced to a cloud of shimmering particles in a matter of seconds. The horror of the sight was matched only by the cold, analytical part of his brain that realized the enemy was not just destroying them, they were harvesting them. The metallic dust was being drawn toward the silver ships, integrated into their hulls to repair the minor scuffs caused by the kinetic rounds. This was a war of consumption, a biological imperative dressed in the skin of advanced physics. He turned back to the console where Sura was frantically typing. They had managed to establish a link between the fragment and the station's primary communications array. The plan was to broadcast a massive, corrupted data packet at the frequency of the fragment's beacon. If it worked, it would act like a feedback loop, overloading the internal systems of any ship tuned to that specific quantum signature. It was a crude, brutal tactic, the digital equivalent of throwing a handful of sand into a precision-engineered engine. But Kress knew that in the history of human conflict, the crude and the brutal had often carried the day when elegance had failed. He placed his hand over Sura's, his grip firm. He told her to initiate the broadcast. As she hit the final command, the entire lab shuddered, the sheer power of the transmission causing the lights to flicker and the air to crackle with static. Outside, the sky erupted in a brilliant, blinding flash of blue as the signal hit the lead alien vessel. For the first time, the enemy's rhythm was broken. The feedback loop was not a clean break, but a jagged, violent tearing of the enemy's cohesion. On the tactical monitors, the lead silver vessel did not explode in the traditional sense of chemical combustion. Instead, its fluid geometry began to thrash as if the ship itself was suffering a grand mal seizure. The smooth, mirrored surface bubbled and erupted into chaotic crystalline growths that mirrored the fragment on Sura's workbench. Within seconds, the elegant predator had become a bloated, shuddering wreck of semi-solid light and jagged glass, drifting aimlessly as its internal logic devoured its own hull. The secondary vessels in the alien formation veered away sharply, their movements no longer graceful but frantic, their sensor arrays likely blinded by the screaming digital static Kress and Sura had unleashed. A cheer went up in the command deck, a brief, sharp outburst of relief that was quickly silenced by the grim reality on the main viewscreen. They had wounded one, but 5 more were already reconfiguring their approach, angling toward the planetary poles where the magnetic interference of the Foundry's core was strongest. Vane's voice crackled over the internal channel, demanding a status update on the transmission. Sura reported that the station's primary communications array was melting under the thermal load of the broadcast, the superconducting cables turning to slag from the sheer volume of data being pushed through them. They could not sustain the signal for more than a few more minutes, and the alien fleet was already adapting, shifting their communication frequencies to a spectrum the fragment could no longer mirror. Kress watched the heat readouts on the console climb into the red, the smell of scorched insulation filling the small lab. He knew that the victory was temporary. They had shown their hand, and the enemy was a fast learner. The silver ships were now spreading out, forming a wide perimeter around the planet's upper atmosphere, effectively cordoning off the Foundry world from the rest of the system. They weren't just attacking anymore, they were beginning a siege. The ground beneath them groaned as the station's heavy defensive batteries opened fire again, this time aiming for the atmospheric entry vectors. The high-velocity slugs tore through the orange clouds, creating massive shockwaves that rattled the spires. Kress looked out at the horizon and saw the first of the alien drop pods, smaller, needle-like versions of the capital ships, streaking toward the surface like falling stars. They weren't targeting the administrative centers or the shipyards. They were heading for the geothermal taproots. The enemy had realized that the station's power came from the planet itself, and they were moving to sever the arteries of the Foundry. If the taps were compromised, the life support, the shields, and the fabrication plants would all go dark, leaving the millions of workers trapped in a cold, airless tomb. Kress grabbed his gear, his mind already calculating the transit time to the southern taproot, the largest and most vulnerable of the three. He told Sura to stay with the fragment and try to find a way to isolate the specific frequency the drop pods were using for their local coordination. If she could find a way to jam their short-range links, it might give the ground security teams a fighting chance. Sura looked terrified, her hands trembling as she adjusted the containment field, but she didn't argue. She knew that Kress was the only one who understood the physical layout of the sublevels well enough to navigate the chaos that was about to unfold. Kress slipped his helmet back on, the hiss of the seal a grimly familiar sound. He left the lab and headed for the rapid transit tubes, passing squads of security personnel who were distributing heavy-duty plasma cutters and industrial explosives. They were no longer just technicians and guards. They were the last line of defense for a world that was being systematically dismantled. The journey to the southern taproot took him through the heart of the industrial sector. The massive fabrication halls were eerily quiet now, the assembly lines frozen in mid-motion as power was diverted to the defense grid. Huge half-finished hull sections hung from the ceiling like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts, casting long shadows over the empty floor. Kress pushed his transit cart to its limit, the small vehicle humming as it sped through the service tunnels. He could hear the muffled thuds of the drop pods impacting the surface far above, the vibrations traveling through the rock and metal like the footfalls of a giant. When he finally reached the southern primary junction, he found a scene of total carnage. The security detail assigned to the level had been decimated, not by fire or projectiles, but by the same deconstruction pulses he had seen in orbit. The walls were weeping liquefied metal, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and something sharp and chemical. In the center of the junction, 3 of the needle-like alien craft had pierced the ceiling, their sharp points embedded deep into the floor. They were unfolding like metallic flowers, their petals consisting of layers of that same translucent, shifting material. From within the pods, spindly, multi-legged constructs were emerging, their movements jerky and insectoid. They weren't living creatures in the biological sense, but sophisticated, autonomous drones designed for one purpose: the total integration of foreign technology into their own network. Kress watched from behind a heavy reinforced pillar as one of the drones approached the main geothermal conduit. It didn't use a torch or a drill. It simply touched the metal with a glowing appendage, and the thick titanium plate began to unravel into a fine mist of particles that were sucked into the drone's central core. They were eating the station. He knew his plasma cutter wouldn't be enough to stop them. The drones were made of the same adaptive material as the ships, capable of absorbing and redistributing energy. He needed something more primitive, something that didn't rely on the very electronics the drones were designed to subvert. He looked around the junction and saw a heavy-duty manual demolition charge, a leftover from the original excavation of the taproot. It was a chemical explosive, triggered by a simple mechanical percussion cap. It was old, dangerous, and completely devoid of the sophisticated circuitry the aliens could hijack. He scrambled toward the storage locker, keeping low to avoid the scanning beams of the drones. The drones were focused on the conduit, their internal processors likely occupied with the massive energy flow they were trying to redirect. Kress reached the locker and hauled out the demolition charge, the heavy cylinder weighing nearly 50 kilos. He primed the mechanical timer, his fingers steady despite the proximity of the alien machines. He had to place the charge directly on the central hub of the pods, where their coordination signals would be strongest. If he could trigger a physical blast at the heart of their local network, the resulting pressure wave and shrapnel might be enough to disrupt their cohesion before they could adapt. He began to crawl toward the pods, dragging the charge behind him. The heat in the junction was rising as the drones began to bypass the cooling cycles of the geothermal tap. The hum of the planet's core was becoming a roar, a protest of the Earth itself against the intrusion. Kress could feel the sweat stinging his eyes inside his helmet, his breath coming in short, hot gasps. He was less than 10 meters from the pods when one of the drones paused, its sensor head pivoting toward his position. Kress froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The drone's eye was a cluster of glowing blue apertures that seemed to pulse with a cold, calculating intelligence. It didn't see him as a living being, he realized. It saw him as a low-grade biological anomaly, a nuisance to be cleared. The drone began to move toward him, its legs clicking on the metal floor with terrifying speed. Kress didn't wait. He stood up, hefted the demolition charge with a grunt of exertion, and sprinted toward the pods. The drone let out a high-pitched trill, a pulse of blue light narrowcasting toward him. The beam grazed his shoulder, and he felt the outer layers of his suit begin to flake away, the armor turning to dust. The pain was an icy, searing jolt that nearly made him drop the charge, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. He reached the base of the nearest pod and slammed the charge into the gap where the petals met the floor. He hammered the mechanical detonator with his fist and threw himself backward, rolling into a shallow maintenance trench just as the timer hit 0. The explosion was a deafening, physical force that slammed into his chest and rattled his teeth. Unlike the elegant, silent pulses of the alien weapons, this was a raw, primitive release of chemical energy. A massive fireball erupted in the center of the junction, fueled by the pressurized gases in the cooling lines. The shrapnel from the pods and the station floor became a lethal storm of jagged metal, shredding the drones and puncturing the delicate internal membranes of the needle craft. The shockwave buckled the ceiling and sent a cascade of rock and steel raining down on the intruders. Kress lay in the trench, covered in soot and debris, his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear the sirens. He looked up and saw that the blue glow had vanished. The pods were twisted, smoking ruins, and the drones lay in pieces, their silver bodies blackened and broken by the force of the blast. The geothermal conduit was damaged, leaking a thick cloud of steam, but it was still intact. He had stopped the bleed. He struggled to his feet, his suit tattered and his shoulder throbbing with a dull, throbbing ache where the beam had touched him. He checked his HUD. The local sensors were offline, but the emergency lights were still holding. He had won this round, but the station was far from safe. He could feel the vibration of more pods hitting the surface, more needles seeking the heart of the world. He picked up a piece of a shattered drone, the metal still warm and humming with a dying energy. They were not invincible. They were just machines, albeit incredibly advanced ones, and machines could be broken. He looked at the wreckage of the junction and felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Humanity had spent centuries learning how to tear things apart and put them back together. If these invaders wanted a war of deconstruction, they had picked the wrong species to mess with. Kress began to make his way back to the transit tubes, his pace slow but determined. He needed to get back to Vane and Sura to tell them that the old ways still worked. The iron horizon was closing in, but Kress was starting to see a path through the dark, one paved with the very grit and fire that had built the foundry world in the first place. The transition from the scorched silence of the lower deeps to the frantic energy of the mid-level staging areas was a sensory assault that nearly brought Kress to his knees. He emerged from the transit tube into a deck filled with the sounds of heavy labor and the sharp, metallic tang of industrial-grade welding. Thousands of workers were no longer manning the fabrication lines for export. They were stripping the station itself to build barricades and improvised weaponry. Massive sheets of reinforced hull plating were being bolted over the internal corridors, turning the sprawling facility into a honeycomb of kill zones. Kress leaned against the vibrating wall of the transport hub, his breath rattling in his chest. His suit was a tattered mess of polymer and ceramic, the shoulder section missing entirely where the alien beam had disintegrated the material. He didn't look like a technician anymore. He looked like a ghost returned from a battlefield that the rest of the station was only beginning to understand. A medical drone hovered toward him, its scanners chirping as it assessed the thermal burns on his arm, but Kress waved it away with a frustrated grunt. He had no time for sedatives or sterile patches. He pushed through the crowd of laborers, heading for the primary lift that would take him back to the command spire. He noticed that the workers were using heavy mining lasers and high-pressure plasma cutters as if they were rifles, their faces set in a grim mask of focus. There was no panic here, only the cold, methodical preparation of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting against the physics of a hostile universe. If the silver ships wanted the foundry world, they would have to take it one rivet and one bolt at a time, and every meter would be bought with the blood of those who had forged it. When Kress finally reached the command deck, the atmosphere was even more tense than when he had left. Vane was standing over a tactical display that showed hundreds of red icons descending through the upper atmosphere. The orbital shipyards were gone, reduced to a belt of debris that was now being pulled into the planet's gravity well. The expansion fleets had been scattered, with only a handful of heavy cruisers managed to escape into the outer system to regroup. The foundry world was isolated, a single spark of defiance in a sector that was rapidly going dark. Sura was still at her station, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, her hands moving across the interface with a desperate speed. She looked up as Kress approached, her face pale. She told him that the fragment was changing. It was no longer just a passive receiver. It was beginning to pulse with a rhythmic frequency that matched the seismic activity of the planet's core. Vane turned to Kress, his eyes narrowing as he took in the technician's battered appearance. He asked for a report on the southern taproot. Kress explained that the initial breach had been contained using a chemical demolition charge, and that the alien drones were susceptible to physical, non-electronic trauma. He argued that their technology was so integrated into the quantum fabric of the universe that it struggled to compute the chaotic, messy reality of high-velocity shrapnel and chemical fire. The aliens were poets of light and logic, but humanity was a species of hammers and anvils. To win this, they had to stop trying to match the enemy's sophistication and instead force the enemy to fight on human terms. They needed to turn the entire station into a giant, primitive trap. Sura interrupted, her voice trembling as she pointed to a new set of data on her screen. She had been tracking the pulses from the fragment and realized they were being answered from deep within the planet's mantle. It wasn't just the alien fleet from above that they had to worry about. The sphere Kress had found earlier hadn't been a scout for a fleet, it had been a key. It was unlocking something that had been buried beneath the crust since long before humans had ever arrived in this system. The geothermal taps hadn't just been drawing heat, they had been providing the energy required to wake up a dormant infrastructure that spanned the entire interior of the world. The silver ships in orbit weren't there to conquer the planet, they were there to witness its rebirth. The foundry world was not a world at all, it was a cocoon. The floor beneath them suddenly buckled, a massive seismic tremor throwing everyone to the ground. The sound was not the roar of an earthquake, but the shriek of metal being torn asunder on a planetary scale. On the view screen, the obsidian planes of the surface were cracking open, revealing veins of that same shimmering blue light that Kress had seen in the sublevels. Massive structures, kilometers long and impossibly sleek, were beginning to push their way through the crust, shedding millions of tons of rock like discarded skin. The foundry world was unfolding, its industrial surface being cast aside to reveal a machine of such immense proportions that it defied human comprehension. The station itself was nothing more than a parasite clinging to the hull of a god-sized vessel. Vane stood up, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. He looked at the screen, his expression a mixture of awe and absolute horror. He realized that every megawatt of power they had generated, every ship they had built, and every colony they had established had been unknowingly contributing to the activation of this machine. They had been the caretakers of their own destruction. He looked at Kress and asked what the hammer and anvil approach could possibly do against something that could crack a planet. Kress didn't have an answer, not at first. He looked at the fragment on the table, still pulsing with that cold, blue light. He remembered the way the drone had flinched before the explosion, the way the silver ship had thrashed when its logic was corrupted. He told Vane that even a god could be poisoned. The machine unfolding beneath them was a system, and every system had a point of failure. The geothermal taps were still connected to the machine's core. If they could overload the taps not with power, but with a massive, localized infusion of the very industrial waste the foundry produced, the molten slag, the corrosive chemicals, the radioactive isotopes, they might be able to choke the machine before it fully emerged. It was a suicide mission for the station. To do it, they would have to intentionally cause a core meltdown in the primary reactors, venting the resulting mess directly into the machine's intake valves. It would destroy the foundry world, but it might take the enemy with it. The command deck fell silent. They were talking about the total destruction of everything they had built, the loss of millions of lives, and the end of their presence in this quadrant. But as they watched the alien fleet in orbit begin to descend toward the emerging structures, they knew there was no other choice. The silver ships were coming to claim their prize, and humanity was just an infestation to be cleared away. Vane looked at the officers in the room, then at Kress. He gave the order. They would begin the evacuation of the civilian sectors immediately, using every available hauler and scout ship to get as many people as possible into the void. The technical crews and security teams would stay behind to facilitate the meltdown. Kress volunteered to return to the lower levels to manually override the safety limiters on the reactors. He knew the layout of the cooling loops better than anyone, and he knew that the automated systems would never allow a deliberate meltdown of this magnitude. Sura stayed with him, insisting that she could use the fragment to mask their energy signatures while they worked. They left the command deck, heading back into the bowels of the station as the world around them continued to tear itself apart. The air was now thick with the sound of grinding stone and the hum of ancient engines waking up from a million-year sleep. Kress felt a strange sense of calm. He had been a builder all his life, a man who took pride in the integrity of his work. Now he was going to be the one to break the world, and he would do it with the same precision and grit he had once used to maintain it. As they descended, they saw the walls of the corridors peeling away to reveal the alien technology beneath. It was beautiful and terrifying, a labyrinth of glowing filaments and shifting geometries. The drones were everywhere now, but they ignored Kress and Sura, their focus entirely on the grand reconstruction occurring around them. The humans were irrelevant. Kress pushed past a shimmering wall of blue energy, his manual wrench held tight in his hand. He didn't need high-tech sensors to find the reactors. He could feel the heat, a blistering, angry radiance that spoke of a power source being pushed far beyond its design. He reached the primary containment chamber, the massive lead-lined doors vibrating with the force of the internal pressure. He looked at Sura, who was holding the fragment like a talisman. They were at the heart of the monster, and it was time to give it a fatal dose of human industry. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of screaming metal and white-hot light, where the physical laws of the foundry world were being stretched to their breaking point. The massive magnetic bottles that held the fusion cores were straining against the gravitational distortion caused by the planet's unfolding. Kress could feel the radiation through the lead-lined layers of his suit, a prickly, invisible heat that tasted of copper on the back of his throat. Sura moved to the primary terminal, her hands flying across the physical keys that had been installed as a failsafe against digital intrusion. The station was shuddering with a rhythmic cadence now, the sound of the ancient machine beneath the crust beginning to synchronize its heartbeat with the reactors. It was trying to integrate the human power grid into its own awakening, using the station as a starter motor for a planetary engine. Kress ignored the display screens and went straight for the mechanical flow regulators, his heavy wrench ready to shatter the governor locks that prevented a thermal runaway. Around them, the very architecture of the room was beginning to change. The steel floor was being replaced by a semi-translucent silver lattice that felt like walking on frozen mercury. The drones were no longer just observers. They were beginning to weave themselves into the reactor's cooling lines, attempting to stabilize the human technology and repurpose it. Kress saw one of the insectoid constructs latch onto a high-pressure valve, its glowing appendages attempting to weld the mechanism shut. He didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy iron wrench with a grunt of primal exertion, the blow shattering the drone's delicate sensors and sending it spinning into the coolant mist. He wasn't fighting a war of philosophy or physics anymore. He was a man with a hammer, and the universe was full of things that needed breaking. He reached the first regulator and slammed the wrench into the locking pin, the metal shearing with a satisfying crack that echoed through the chamber. Sura shouted over the roar of the venting plasma, her voice barely audible over the screech of the turbines. She told him that the fragment was reaching a critical state of resonance. It was acting as a bridge, drawing the corrupted data she had programmed into it and broadcasting it directly into the silver lattice that was now coating the walls. The poison was being absorbed into the machine's nervous system even as it tried to consume the reactor's energy. On her screen, the elegant geometric patterns of the alien logic were being overwritten by the chaotic, jagged code of human industrial protocols. It was like injecting a precision clockwork mechanism with a gallon of molten lead. The machine began to fight back, the blue light in the room shifting to a violent, angry violet. The gravitational fields fluctuated wildly, at one moment pinning Kress to the floor and the next making him feel as though he were falling into an endless abyss. Kress reached the second regulator, but his way was blocked by a wall of shimmering force that had materialized out of the air. It wasn't a solid barrier, but a localized distortion of space, a defensive measure triggered by the machine's internal security. He looked at Sura, who was struggling to keep her feet as the floor tilted beneath her. She signaled that she couldn't bypass the field from the terminal. It was a physical manifestation of the machine's will. Kress looked at the barrier and then at the tattered remains of his suit. He realized that the field was calibrated to repel high-energy signatures and complex electronics. He reached for the manual demolition charge he had carried from the transit hub, the same primitive chemical explosive that had worked in the taproot. It was a lump of inert matter, invisible to a system that thought in terms of quantum states and light lattices. He took a deep breath, the air in the chamber now a toxic soup of ozone and vaporized lubricants. He sprinted toward the barrier, ignoring the way his vision blurred as he passed through the outer edges of the distortion. The force field felt like walking through thick, electrified syrup, every nerve in his body screaming in protest. But the charge remained silent, a primitive tool of destruction that the machine could not comprehend. He reached the regulator and slammed the charge against the casing, the magnet on the cylinder clicking into place. He didn't use a timer this time. He pulled the manual fuse pin and threw himself away from the regulator, sliding across the mercury-like floor toward the cooling pits. The explosion was a sharp, localized thud that lacked the elegance of the alien weapons, but it did exactly what it was designed to do. The regulator housing vanished in a cloud of shrapnel and black smoke, and the cooling flow to the primary reactor died instantly. The sound that followed was unlike anything Kress had ever heard. It was the sound of a star trying to die inside a metal box. The fusion core, no longer contained by the cooling cycle, began to expand, the heat rising so fast that the internal sensors melted before they could register the peak. The white-hot plasma began to leak into the geothermal conduits, following the path of the siphons deep into the planet's mantle. But it wasn't just heat they were sending down. It was the corrupted data from the fragment, the industrial toxins Sura had harvested from the waste vats, and the raw, unrefined grit of the foundry world. They were vomiting the entire history of human industry into the heart of the ancient machine. The violet light began to flicker and die, replaced by a dirty orange glow that spoke of burning oil and melting iron. Sura scrambled toward Kress, her terminal now a smoking ruin of fused plastic. She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumph. She shouted that they had to leave, that the reaction was now self-sustaining. The reactor was in a state of total collapse, and the thermal wave was already traveling down the taproots. The station was beginning to tear itself apart, the upper spires snapping off and falling into the opening chasms of the planet's surface. They ran for the emergency escape pods, their movements heavy and sluggish as the station's gravity failed. The silver lattice on the walls was turning black and brittle, the alien technology unable to cope with the influx of chaotic, low-grade matter. The God machine was choking on the very species it had tried to use as a battery. They reached the pod bay just as the primary deck plates began to buckle. The bay was a scene of controlled chaos, with the last of the technical crews boarding the small, spherical craft. Kress pushed Sura into a pod and checked the coordinates for the rendezvous point in the outer system. He looked back at the corridor one last time, seeing the orange fire of the meltdown chasing them through the shadows. The foundry world was gone, replaced by a battlefield of fire and glass. He climbed into the pod and sealed the hatch, the hiss of the airlock the last sound he heard before the explosive bolts fired, launching them into the void. As the pod accelerated away from the station, Kress watched through the small viewing port. The planet was no longer a sphere. It was an unfolding nightmare of metal and energy, but the movement had slowed. The elegant, kilometers-long structures were stalling, their surfaces covered in the same black, crystalline rot that had consumed the fragment. The silver ships in orbit were breaking formation, their hulls rippling with the same violet interference. The poison had reached the source. The ancient machine, which had waited for eons to be reborn, was being dragged back into the dark by the weight of human persistence. It was a victory of the crude over the complex, of the hammer over the lattice. Kress leaned back in his seat, the vibration of the pod's small engines the only thing keeping him grounded. He was covered in soot, he was irradiated, and he was the man who had broken a world. He closed his eyes, the image of the burning orange horizon etched into his mind, and for the first time in years, he felt the heavy, honest weight of a job well done. The pod drifted further into the blackness of space, leaving the dying planet behind. Kress could see the distant glimmers of the human expansion fleets, the tiny sparks of light representing the survivors who had managed to escape the initial onslaught. They were broken and scattered, but they were still there. The alien fleet was in disarray, the connection to their planetary hive mind severed by the industrial filth that Kress and Sura had unleashed. The war was not over, not by a long shot, but the terms of the engagement had changed. The universe was no longer a place of quiet observation and inevitable consumption. It was a place of grit, of fire, and of a species that refused to be integrated into anyone else's design. Kress looked at Sura, who was already monitoring the pod's limited sensor array, her face set in that same grimly determined look he had seen on the workers in the fabrication halls. They were humans, and they were very good at surviving. The escape pod was a cramped, vibrating shell of titanium and composite, a tiny bubble of atmosphere adrift in a sea of radioactive debris. Kress watched through the reinforced viewport as the world he had called home underwent a final, agonizing transformation. The planet did not shatter, it seized. The massive silver structures that had been attempting to unfurl like the petals of a celestial flower were now locked in a frozen, jagged state of mid-expansion. The black rot of the industrial poison had spread across the entire surface, a dark network of soot and corrupted logic that looked like a layer of grease on a mirror. The brilliant blue and violet lights that had signaled the machine's awakening were replaced by the dull, sputtering orange of localized fires and cooling slag. The god machine was dead in the water, a planetary-scale wreck that would serve as a monument to the price of underestimating human defiance. Kress felt the pod's thrusters kick in, a rhythmic pulse that signaled the autopilot was correcting their trajectory toward the gravity well of a nearby gas giant where the fleet was hiding. Beside him, Sura was hunched over the pod's small diagnostic screen, her face illuminated by the green glow of the emergency interface. She wasn't looking at the wreckage behind them, she was looking at the long-range sensor data. She told Kress that the alien fleet in orbit was no longer a cohesive force. Without the guiding signal from the world machine, the silver ships were drifting like blind insects, their hulls rippling with erratic, nonsensical geometries. Some were colliding with the debris of the orbital shipyards, while others were simply dissolving back into that fine metallic dust, unable to maintain their physical integrity without the quantum anchor they had come to claim. It was a total systemic failure. The sophistication that had made them so terrifying was now the very thing that ensured their collapse once the central logic was compromised. They were a civilization built on a perfect foundation, and they had no defense against a world that was inherently, intentionally messy. Kress leaned his head back against the padded bulkhead, the adrenaline finally receding to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion. He looked at his hands, which were stained with grease, coolant, and the dark residue of the fragment. He thought about the millions of people on the transport ships, the miners, the fabricators, and the engineers who were now homeless, scattered across the stars. The foundry world was gone, and with it, the backbone of human industry in this quadrant. They had lost their factories, their shipyards, and their history. But as he listened to the steady, mechanical thump of the pod's life support, he realized that they hadn't lost their essence. The iron horizon hadn't been a boundary of their progress, it had been a forge. Everything they had built had been a rehearsal for the moment they had to tear it all down to survive. The hours passed in a blur of low-oxygen haze and the soft chime of the pod's proximity sensors. Eventually, the massive, swirling clouds of the gas giant filled the viewport, a majestic tapestry of gold and ochre that made the violence of the foundry world seem like a distant, insignificant spark. From the shadow of the planet's largest moon, the survivors began to emerge. Dozens of heavy haulers, their hulls scarred and blackened by the initial engagement, formed a protective circle around the smaller scout ships and civilian transports. It was a fleet of ghosts, held together by nothing more than the grit of their crews and the shared trauma of their escape. Kress felt a surge of pride as he saw the lights of a recovery cruiser approaching their pod. Even now, in the wake of a planetary apocalypse, humans were organizing, repairing, and looking toward the next horizon. The docking process was a series of jarring metallic clunks and the hiss of equalizing pressure. When the hatch finally opened, Kress and Sura were pulled into the sterile, bustling environment of the cruiser's hangar bay. The air tasted of recycled air and medicinal cleansers, a sharp contrast to the ozone and soot of the sublevels. A medical team moved to assist them, but Kress pushed himself upright, his boots clattering on the deck plates. He saw Vane standing near the hangar's control station, his arm in a sling and his face, aged by a decade in the span of a single day. The High Overseer looked at Kress, then at Sura, and finally out at the distant, dark silhouette of the world they had broken. He didn't offer a speech or a medal. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement between men who had done what was necessary. Vane spoke in a voice that was gravelly and low, telling them that the long-range arrays had picked up signals from the core systems. The expansion fleets were mobilizing in earnest now, no longer as explorers, but as a consolidated war machine. The observers had made a mistake. By attacking the foundry world, they had unified a species that was usually defined by its internal friction. Humanity was no longer interested in the elegant exploration of the stars. They were going to rebuild, and they were going to do it with the knowledge that the universe was a battlefield. They would build ships that didn't rely on the grace of light lattices, but on the stubborn reliability of solid steel and chemical fire. They would turn every mining colony into a fortress and every shipyard into an armory. The age of the builder had ended, and the age of the soldier-technician had begun. Kress walked to the edge of the hangar bay, looking out through the massive atmospheric shielding at the stars beyond. He knew that his life as a simple foundry worker was over. He was a veteran of a war that most of humanity didn't even know had started, and he possessed the knowledge of how to kill the unkillable. He looked at the fragment of the silver drone he had kept in his pocket, now just a dull, inert piece of scrap metal. He let it drop from his fingers, watching it bounce once on the deck before rolling into a drainage grate. He didn't need it anymore. He had the memory of the fire, the weight of the wrench, and the knowledge that no matter how advanced the enemy was, they could still be broken by someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Sura joined him at the railing, her eyes reflecting the distant glow of the gas giant's rings. She asked him if he thought they would ever go back, if they would ever try to reclaim the foundry world. Kress shook his head slowly. He told her that there was nothing left to reclaim. The planet was a tomb now, for a god that never should have woken up, and a civilization that had outgrown its cradle. Their future wasn't back there in the orange haze of the obsidian plains. It was forward, in the dark, cold spaces between the stars, where the enemy was still waiting. They would find the silver ships, and they would show them the true meaning of human industry. They would build a new horizon, one made of iron and fire, and this time they wouldn't be the ones being watched. The recovery cruiser's engines flared to life, a powerful vibration that hummed through the soles of Kress's boots. The fleet began to move, a slow and deliberate procession of metal and will, heading toward the jump point that would take them back to the human core. Behind them, the ruins of the foundry world slowly faded into the blackness, a jagged scar against the tapestry of the galaxy. Kress watched until the last flicker of orange light vanished, leaving only the cold, steady glow of the distant suns. He took a deep breath, the air in the cruiser feeling cleaner and sharper than any he had ever known. He was Kress, a man of the forge, and while his world had burned, his spirit had been tempered into something far harder and far more dangerous. The iron horizon was no longer a limit, it was a weapon, and he was ready to wield it.